it goes. Okay, so we have about 40 minutes. All right, so I had a lot more fun when I was chatting to Mike about JavaScript frameworks. But cool, thanks everyone for coming. And let's get into it. So there's kind of 5 things I want to touch on today. The first is just a bit of an overview of who am I, like what is the kind of the perspective that I bring. Then I want to just take a moment of kind of vulnerability. I want to kind of share a bit about kind of my own journey and so forth. I want to chat a bit about the stigma around mental illness and so forth. Then, no surprises, I want to chat about kind of the industry and the intersection between mental health and mental illness and the tech industry. And then I kind of just want to make a space for like some discussion. Because plot twist, if you're coming here looking for like a nice packaged conclusion or some deep insight or something, the door's still open, now's your chance to go. I just told Mike now before I started that this is one of those interesting talks that the more I do it, the harder it actually gets. Most of the other talks I do, over time, you kind of get a feel for, you know, how people respond, what are the good stuff, what is valuable, what's not that useful, and you kind of refine it and it becomes easier. This one gets harder because I think when I started doing it, I had a very naive and simplistic view of the reality that is mental illness in the world of tech. And the more I do it, the more it's just like, oh man, like there's just so much to touch on. Couple of disclaimers. I am not a doctor. I don't have a medical background. I have a master's degree. It's in painting. I studied visual arts. So don't take any of this as medical advice. Okay. In general, don't take any of this as advice, but specifically medical advice. I'm just a guy trying to figure out where he finds himself in terms of the circumstances and his own realities and so forth, and trying to map that out with the hope that that's useful to someone to some degree. And as mentioned, you know, I'm warning you guys now, this is very hard to really wrap up, to say, okay, cool, and that concludes our talk, like these are the 3 key points. There's a lot to unpack, and a lot of it don't have clear answers, and I don't have clear answers. So more often than not, it's effectively just when time runs out, discussion's over. So I actually run, I don't know whether I should call it a podcast, but so with a very good friend of mine, Schalk, who, yeah, it's a strange situation since we're both called Schalk, and I've never been on a platform with someone else called Schalk as well. So it's like Schalk V and Schalk N. So he also has his own struggles and so forth, and also a long history of addiction and so forth. And effectively, you know, like we've also realized that we have discussions with people in the tech industry about mental health and mental illness and so forth. And we've also realized, like, you know, effectively we just need to see when an hour is gone, and then we're like, okay, cool, we need to start wrapping it up now. There's no clear point where it starts heading in a conclusion, because anything you unpack, anything you open, anything you look at just has 20 more questions and 50 other things that need to be discussed. And we have 40 minutes. So I'm going to try and squish in as much as possible, so I might go a bit quick, but yeah, I would like for us to have a bit of time afterwards to chat and have an open discussion, so let's go. So who am I? So I actually don't have a formal background in tech. As mentioned, I have a background in visual arts, and at some point I realized that, oh yeah, now I need to start thinking about salary and, you know, paying rent and all of that. And yeah, it was hard making a living as an artist. Some of my friends still do it, but sure, it's very mentally demanding. So luckily I did some HTML and stuff back in the day, knew a bit of tech. It's a long story, and I ended up getting into the world of tech. Because when I got into the world of tech, there was this thing called web design, which is just part of general graphic design. So you did a flyer and a book cover and all of that the same way as you would do a website. So I was like, hey, I'm qualified. And then kind of this whole front-end UI, all of that started coming on, and I just rode that wave. And so because of that, I think I have I had a pretty rough journey into the world of tech, and I think also to a certain degree, I'm still trying to make sense of the world of tech and so forth, so I often find myself in spaces where I do a lot of teaching and training. I'm currently at CodeSpace down there on the right. Also because my journey, I don't have a formal background, I kind of grew up in the world of open source as well, contributed a lot to the world of open source. I have a 1-year-old daughter now, so yeah, that's not happening. And I generally do contract work. I mostly work for myself. I'm a freelance developer, designer, and so forth. I'm just glad this year on the tag. So last year I had filled in my company, and the company is registered as Schalk Pty Ltd, and they actually put it on the tag. Yeah, you remember that. And like this year it just says freelance consultant, and I'm like, thank goodness. Okay. Yeah, I'm all over the place. If you want to get in touch with me, just search Schalk Tech, Schalk JavaScript. There's only so many Schalk in the world of tech. I have this joke that I keep on making. I should probably start retiring it. I think you heard it last year as well, where I said that if this was an agricultural conference or like a game range expo or something, there would be a ton of Schalk in tech world, it's very easy to find me. All right, and so I live in the northern suburbs. Northern suburbs for life, CY. CY till you die. And I often joke my wife is from Strand, and I said it's C-E-Y, and I'm like, go to Strand and see exactly why. But yeah, so generally when I did talks and stuff, geez, if she sees this recording, I'm a dead man. So generally when I did talks and stuff, as part of kind of like talking about like who I am, my history, and my personal life and so forth, I often mentioned as well that, you know, like I have a very long history with mental health and mental illness. I'm currently on Cipralex and Venlaw. It changed my life, and I would just mention it on the side. And I had to remove that from my introduction, because what ended up happening, like people would actually ask questions about that during the talk, and it would actually derail the topic itself. And so then the question is, okay, there is a lot of interest in this. People really want to talk about it. I should probably actually start talking about it deliberately instead of mentioning it on the side. So then I thought about this idea of maybe actually doing a talk on mental illness and mental health. And I actually asked for advice, and that person is actually sitting here. He can raise his hand if he wants. But he actually gave me a bit of advice that said, you know, I asked like, what would you want from a talk like this? And so he effectively mentioned that, you know, one of the first things I should open up about kind of my own emotions and so forth, instead of like, hey, here's mental health, here's mental illness, let's talk about it. Instead, like start with kind of where I'm at, how I'm feeling and so forth, and open up around that, like being vulnerable. And it's a difficult thing, being vulnerable and honest, but I do think it sets the stage for a conversation like this. So effectively, if you guys are in tech, you know, kind of this notion of eating the dog food, which is effectively, you know, like taking your own advice or using your own product or so forth. And so effectively, what I want to do is I want to eat the dog food to a certain degree when it comes to vulnerability and honesty. And also on the topic of eating, so Mark Twain also said, you know, if you eat a live frog first thing in the morning, the worst part of your day is over, okay? So I kind of want to take that approach to this talk as well, and I want to dive into the part that is kind of the part where I have to make myself vulnerable. I have to kind of be honest. And in order to do that, we have to go back a bit and into the prehistoric times that is 2014, where COVID was still just a distant memory. Or not a memory, a distant, I don't know, what's something that's in the future, a distant upcoming thing. So this was me. I started my first job, and I have struggled with mental health on and off a bit. But I was functional. I was still studying. Up until this point, I was studying. 2014 is when I got my first job. And I think all the stress of that, like, really sent me in a spiral, sent me into a very strange place. And I remember I had a friend visit from overseas. And, sure, guys, this is so difficult to talk about. I had a friend visit from overseas, and I think we kind of went and did something, and she took some photos, put it on Facebook. And I remember I was on the train going to work the next day, and I saw the photos. And so up until that point, I've been struggling a lot with like obsessive thoughts. I don't think I have OCD. I don't have the compulsions, but I definitely have the obsessive behavior. And I think I was just struck by this idea that maybe my face is skew, and it was these exact photos. So I looked at that and I got obsessed with this idea that my face is skew. And to make a long story short, it got so bad that I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I didn't want to live anymore. And I actually went to a plastic surgeon where I'm like, dude, because I was convinced my face is so skew that it makes other people uncomfortable. And he's like, dude, you don't need a plastic surgeon, you need a therapist. And so this is actually, so the first time when I shared this, I was like, should I put my Reddit username in there? And I was like, oh man, like that's, but like this is literally the worst thing on my profile. There's nothing worse than this. So yeah, go follow me on Reddit if you hate yourself. So this was around like, that's the actual timestamp, the actual date of the comment, 2014. And I think I was responding to someone who said they started struggling with body dysmorphia. And what I said is, I've kind of started developing the same types of thoughts regarding my features, facial structure. January this year, for the first time at the age of 27. You can do the math, figure out how old I am now. Woke up one morning, realized that my smile is skew. The one corner of my mouth doesn't lift up when I smile. I fell into an episode of suicidal depression. I literally didn't want to live anymore. Not being able to sleep or eat, like being so distressed. Getting convinced that people get uncomfortable in my presence due to my distorted face. I went to a plastic surgeon, and he effectively said that, dude, your face is fine. There's nothing wrong with your face. But I kept on obsessing about it, soon developed additional reasons why my face looks strange and makes people uncomfortable when they talk to me. My teeth being yellow, features being asymmetrical. Started going to a psychologist in the hopes that he'll be able to either help me see these thoughts as distortions, delusions, or help me accept the fact that it's true. At that point, I was still very open to the fact, like, all the stuff that I'm perceiving is actually the truth. And I need to learn with being someone who makes other people uncomfortable when they talk to me just because my face is so distorted. And it's so hard talking about this, and it's so hard talking about this because this is flippin' embarrassing, guys. Like, it's hard for me relating to this. What is it, like now, 10 years later? And to a certain degree, you want to kind of disown this part of yourself. But I think in order to have an honest discussion on mental health and mental illness, like, one needs to be able to be open about these embarrassing stuff and the stuff that you're like, I don't know what I was thinking at that time. I don't know. This is so far removed from where I'm at right now. But I said, I'm unable to say whether I'm actually making progress. According to my psychologist, it's quite common for people with pre-existing social anxiety and inclinations towards low self-worth to develop crippling obsessions about their appearance. I don't know the extent to which this applies to you, but the jump from I'm unattractive and I want to kill myself is a big jump, and probably indicative of something deeper that needs to be addressed by a mental health professional. So that is my journey, okay, and that is where my journey into seeking treatment for my own mental health and mental illness started. So that's what put me on the path where I'm now. I wish that wasn't it. I wish I could tell you guys, you know what, I was just feeling a bit blue. I wasn't feeling myself. I just went to go chat to someone and they're like, hey man, like cheer up or whatever. This is unfortunately my journey. And the reason why I share this is because I think for a lot of us, we wish our journey was different. There's a lot of stuff we're embarrassed about. There's a lot of stuff we feel ashamed about. We feel that we need to hide it. People are going to judge us for it. And so then the question is, why come to DevConf and talk about this? Because don't get me wrong, I love talking about the most embarrassing moments in my life on a stage as much as the next guy. So I do a lot of talks. I talk a lot about JavaScript, talk a lot about programming, do a lot of teaching and so forth. This part is a bit harder. And what I've found is that I'm not the only one who finds it hard talking about this. And there's a lot of shame. There's a lot of issues around self-worth and how others perceive you. And I think specifically in an industry like the tech world, where something like imposter syndrome and feeling like you're not good enough is so rife, having these crazy stories and having this reality just makes you feel even more like, man, I'm not cut out for this. Some of you might know this guy, Aaron Swartz. I'm not going to introduce him. There's a phenomenal documentary on him called The Internet's Own Boy, if you want to learn a bit more about him. But he was a very prolific figure in the world of tech. And he did a post in 2007 where he mentioned, I have a lot of illnesses, I don't talk about it, I feel ashamed to have an illness, it sounds absurd, but there's still an enormous stigma around being sick, okay? And for those of you that know his story, so he actually ended up committing suicide. It's complicated. He never left a suicide note or whatever, so people speculate, but one thing that was going on at that point is there was a pending lawsuit against him, and, you know, which was kind of a bit of a legal overreach, and, you know, so a lot of people said, like, that's the cause of the suicide. And so this is a great article by Greg, I'm not going to try and pronounce his surname, where he said that, you know, that is true, and we should be outraged about all that stuff that happened, but we should also not neglect to actually look at his own history of mental health and so forth, because I think we miss an opportunity to talk about people in the world of tech that are struggling with mental illness and mental health. And if someone like him, who was so outspoken about such a range of issues, feels ashamed to talk about it, what does that say about the rest of us? This is a phenomenal book, The Noonday Demon by Andrew Solomon. He looks at specifically depression, but he looks at depression as a historical concept, how our ideas around depression and so forth have kind of shaped through the time, and he looks almost at depression as a sociological phenomenon. And I like his idea of, you know, saying there's so much pain in the world out there, and most people keep it a secret, rolling through agonizing lives in invisible wheelchairs dressed in invisible body casts. So I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that there's a stigma, and it's hard talking about this, and because it's so hard talking about it is why it's also not, there isn't open discussions about this, and why there's so much what would be the word, like strange pop culture notions around mental health, just because people don't talk about it. This is also a message I received after the first time I did the talk, where someone said, hey, listen, I never knew you actually struggled with this stuff. So even myself, you know, it's because when you get the opportunity to say, like the story I just told you guys, when you get the opportunity to just tell that to people, like there's a lot of you here that have known me for a long time that probably heard the story now for the first time, and what a place to hear the story. But here's a problem, like to a certain degree, it's hard for people that actually struggle with these things to actually address the systematic problems around it. And I like his idea of depressed people cannot lead a revolution because depressed people can barely manage to get out of bed and put on their socks. And so the actual stats around it is very discouraging. So there's this organization called OSME, and they do an annual mental health survey in the tech industry. And so one of the questions I asked is, are you more comfortable discussing your physical health or your mental health? And yeah, you can see that little slither there at the bottom, which is kind of people being more comfortable discussing their mental health. The one above it is like either are the same. By far, people are much more comfortable discussing their physical health. Then the other one is even more distressing, which is, have you experienced or observed? Okay, so this isn't even experienced firsthand. This is just actually, have you seen a well-handled and supportive response to mental health issues at work? And effectively, that top line there is no. The second one is maybe, I'm not sure, and I would group that in with no. If you're not sure if a issue around mental health was handled in a well or a supportive manner, it probably wasn't. Okay, and then, so that means about only a third of people have experienced or seen a well-handled response to a mental health issue at work. So then the question is, what do we do about it? And this is the part where, if you're hoping to come to this talk and having me tell you, like, all right, guys, step 1, step 2, I don't know. So, and I think this is also why people don't talk about this, because I have to now come on a stage and make space for this conversation to happen, but I don't have an answer. But I do think we need to talk about it. I do think we can't ignore it. But at the very least, I think one thing that I can say is if we want to look at it purely from an economic point of view, because I think at some point you need to actually, so people that struggle with this stuff, I think it's very easy to get buy-in from people that struggle with this, because it's tough and it's hard and we're trying our best and we want to contribute positively to organizations, to society and so forth, but sometimes it's hard. If you're not, it might be worth just looking at this from an economic and practical point of view, which is in that same survey. I don't know the numbers to this. Let's guess around 80%. 80% of people say they believe that mental health issues affect their productivity. Okay? And I like this quote by Gregory Benford, which says, remember that people break down too, not just machinery. And if you think about how much time and resources we spend on making sure our software does not break and our software is resilient and stable and stays up, compared to how much time we actually spent actually making sure that the people don't break down. And when people break down, there are severe consequences. Because I'm a contractor, I often find myself on both sides of the divide. I sometimes find myself in a position where I'm the most senior person on a team or I'm the most junior person on the team, depending on the team composition. So I've been in places where I'm just a pure worker bee and I just write code and I contribute. I've been in places where I manage a team and I need to look after the team's well-being and so forth. And bringing mental health and mental illness into that mix is, okay? I've been in positions where people just disappear, they break down, they can't cope anymore, and they just go AWOL. And you don't know how far the work is that they've worked on. They haven't pushed any commits. Who's going to take that over? Are they coming back tomorrow? Does someone else need to jump on that? It's mayhem, okay? So I think that's maybe an approach that one can take, is look at this in the same way that we look at the stability. If you think about how much resources goes into uptime and velocity in terms of sprints and all that stuff, and how little of that is actually spent at hey, are you okay? Do you think you're going to be able to come to work tomorrow? Do you think you're still going to be able to do this in a year? Or are you going to be so burnt out that you're just going to leave and we have to find a replacement? So Verge did a survey right after the pandemic, in which they concluded, so they asked around like 12,000 people in the tech industry, are you suffering from burnout, yes or no? And 57% said yes. That is a mind-blowing statistic. That means the majority of people in the tech industry right now, according to the survey, is struggling with burnout. If you are not burnt out right now, you are in the minority. That means if this is the tech industry and you pick a random guy or lady or human, if you pick a random human, sorry, I misspoke there. If you pick a random human, chances are you're going to get someone who's burnt out. You're more likely to pick a random person that's burnt out from this group, statistically, than someone who's not burnt out. That is insane. And I think that's also a place to also start talking about this as well, because I think there's a lot of overlap there in terms of people that have been struggling with mental health things and so forth. Because there's a range of evidence that actually shows that clinically and diagnostically, burnout presents itself in the same way as depression. I think the problem with depression, specifically chronic depression, is that it doesn't just go away. Like you feel like that forever until you go to therapy or you use medication or whatever. But in terms of diagnostically and clinically, it's impossible to tell a person that's burnt out from someone that suffers from actual depression. Yeah, so like it was found that there's no diagnostical difference between people that are depressed and people that are burnt out. So maybe that's a good place to start, and that's maybe a good place to start the conversation, because in the same way, I should have put this in my slide, I didn't even think about it, but in the same way that I've done talks on accessibility as well, and web accessibility and so forth, in the same way that things around accessibility benefits able-bodied people. Like, as someone who has a 1-year-old and who has a new baby on the way now, thank goodness for wheelchair ramps, okay? It is hard, like taking a pram upstairs, but that's a side effect of, accessibility. Another thing is, as someone who has a washing machine in their living room, after 6 o'clock, you need to decide, do you want clean dishes or do you want to be able to hear sound on your TV? You can't have both. Subtitles is a lifesaver. So that's also an issue, that's also a consequence where solving this problem of accessibility, people that are hard of hearing and so forth, actually has all these positive externalities, all these positive benefits for other people. And I do think there's a conversation to be had here in terms of actually, in the industry, talking and focusing on mental health and having discussions around mental health actually benefits people who are quote-unquote neurotypical. Because things that are in place to help people that are struggling with mental breakdowns or have bipolar disease or whatever is going to help people that are feeling burnt out. It's going to help people that feel like they can't cope anymore. Or something acute maybe happened. Something happened in your life, and because of that, you're struggling to cope. Those same things that we put in place would benefit everyone. So I think that's a good angle to start the conversation. And this is maybe also where I want to maybe open the floor and kind of get some feedback or like questions from anyone else here. Sorry, I just want to quickly, but on my number one, okay, we're starting over there. I just want to quickly mention a couple of things. So first and foremost, if you are struggling with mental illness, get in touch with SADAG, get in touch with a support group. Support groups have changed my life. Even if you are going to therapy, having a group that you attend that keeps you accountable and like is such a big difference. Your therapist can't go like, you need to come next week. You need to give me money. A support group is different, like, and it's also the fact that it's free also helps a ton. Okay, like there's a honesty to that relationship that you develop with people that is life-changing. A lot of people think about support groups for addiction and so forth, band support groups around mental health has changed my life. So you can go on SADAG, you can get in touch with them. They kind of put you in touch with a support group in your area. Obviously, you need to phone them and so forth because they want to kind of keep it a safe space and so forth. They don't just want to give the details out freely. OSME is great. I mentioned OSME a couple of times. They have great resources in terms of employees, managers, and so forth around mental health and mental illness. Unfortunately, they are US-based, so a lot of the stuff, I've been wanting to do something South African focused for a very long time around, like, you know, South African legal system, what are your rights as an employee, and so forth and so forth. And then the dorkiest name ever, but like this has helped me a ton, therapistdirectory.co.za. I've found great therapists on there. If you don't have money for therapy, I've definitely been there, studied visual arts. You can actually look at some of the like medical like schools, you know, like Grote Schuur and so forth, and they have a lot of students doing that need to put in practical hours, and they can actually, you can have an arrangement with them where they do consultations with you free of charge. I did one at Grote Schuur with someone who was doing the honors at that point, and I just paid for the venue. It was like 20 Rand a session or something. And then there's also crisistextline.org, which you can reach out to on Facebook or WhatsApp. 7 Cups, I don't know, like 7 Cups didn't really do anything for me, but a lot of people swear by it. You can check it out. They have people that are trained in active listening and so forth. I also want to give a shout out to Paul Gilmartin. I really enjoy his podcast. He speaks very openly about mental health with his guests and so forth. Caveat, just like he is a comedian, so it does get a bit vulgar sometimes, but if you can handle that, it's phenomenal. Also on ZA Tech, I know some of you guys are on the mental health channel there as well. You can check that out. If you want this, if you want these slides, if you want to check anything that I mentioned, you can just go to slides.com/schalkventer. That's where all my slides are on. And then lastly, I did mention that we're doing, I don't know whether I can call it a podcast, but it has all the hallmarks of a podcast. In other words, we actually talk to people, interview people, and we publish that interview online that I'm doing with Schalk Neetbling. I checked this morning, I think the domain is down, but you can just try this at another point again. So that's just mental health, MHIT, so mental health in tech. And that is it.